Is your economy broken, banking not quite fitting the bill? Why not drop the standards a little and add the sex trade, Class A drugs and weapons of war to your reported Treasury statistics? Sounds ridiculous, but under the European Union's new ruling for calculating GDP, which comes into effect in September, prostitution, drugs and weapons trading will all be included. With me now is economist Vicky Pryce to explain what effect, if any, this will have on economies. Well, Vicky, surely this is just a smokescreen because these, let's call them industries, have been around for a long time, so it can't have any effect on economies, surely, other than just making them look healthier on paper.
The overall level of GDP will be going up because we're now going to be counting a lot more things we weren't counting before. It's actually not going to make any difference to growth rates. That's the interesting thing. What the Office of National Statistics has said is that although there are these recalculations that are taking place, they stopped in 2009, they do in fact signify that over a 10-year period, GDP was probably considerably higher than we had thought before, possibly by maybe 60 billion a year. But in fact, it will make no real difference to anything much at all. But what it will make a difference to is once we have a real idea of what those activities are, we'll be able to monitor them. Of course, we know that particularly on prostitution and sort of illegal drugs, there is an issue of whether we control it, whether we deregulate them, and so on. So I think the impact that trade in these areas is going to have as a result of government activity, it's going to be a very important one for them to trace.
But do you think in the end this could maybe backfire then and make almost illegal activities legitimate?
Most of the money that was changing hands has been spent anyway, so that's the black economy we always calculated, which somehow rather never made it into income accounts, with the result, of course, that one wasn't collecting any tax in those activities. It doesn't legitimize it at all. If anything, it puts a lot more control over them because we have a measure of what it is and any ways of trying to refine it and change what actually happens in those areas. It's going to be quite an important one, I think, for policymakers.
Well, critics have suggested that this new way of calculating GDP is a way of sugarcoating Europe's sovereign debt. So do you think it is politically motivated?
There are some things that were going on anyway, which the Office of National Statistics has been trying to sort out, which still are in line with what the European statistical sort of accounting regulations required, which was drawn up last in 1995. So they need to be cleaned up. So some of the changes that are happening have got very little to do with any changes in the way in which things are calculated across Europe. They have to do with us doing it slightly better than before and having things that we didn't do before added into it. There are a number of other changes which have nothing to do with anything to do with Europe, which have to do with a better way of looking at how we are spending various things. For example, research and development. And it's really important to have a real understanding of what companies spend, particularly when they do it in-house, and that isn't normally taken account of. So we're much more R&D oriented and innovative economy than we actually thought. And I think that's pretty good, again, if you're setting the type of policy which is important for growth in the economy. And then there are the ones, because of the changes in European legislation, or at least European requirements on the accounting side. If you add them all together, they account for that increase. It's not just a little bit in terms of what happens on illegal drugs and what happens on prostitution. Nevertheless, those two together seem to account for about £10 billion a year. That's quite significant, and it's something which we didn't have a real handle on before, and I think now we know.
And what sort of effect will this have for stagnant economies, such as Italy, for example?
We've always known, really, what the Italian black economy was like in terms of size. Usually, I think, the estimate had been about 25%. It may be more. Boosting the economy doesn't really make a huge difference. Of course, everyone will be looking at what does it mean from a comparative viewpoint. Now, if you're assuming, of course, that the black market was larger in some countries, and obviously they can suddenly look slightly better. So we are going to be having to watch that and see what it means. But in many ways, it should shame them. We've always known that, and I think Italy had always assumed that its GDP was greater than what the national statistics said there, and the markets have always assumed it. And that's why the economy takes over when there is really no growth in Italy. If you look at current measures of GDP, what we do know, of course, is that there's an awful lot going on that is simply not collected by their statisticians.
Well, France has announced that it won't be using the statistics of prostitution and drugs to measure its GDP. But considering GDP is the major gauge to measure a country's economy, internationally speaking, wouldn't this weaken France? And surely there should be a universal system to measure GDP.
There have always been differences, and that's the reality. But of course, we have Eurostat, which is trying to look across and makes assessments of what the differences perhaps in terms of calculating GDP are and adjust things so we have a slightly better idea of what other countries are doing. That has always been the case. It's been a big debate, of course, as to whether GDP means anything at all. The GDP is not a fantastic measure, but it's the best we've got.
Well, from a layman's perspective, it does seem to make GDP calculations almost farcical, because how can you calculate how much revenue is taken from prostitution or narcotics? Surely it's just guesswork.
Well, we know that there is no revenue in terms of income tax. It would be interesting to see if one could perhaps get some revenue out of that. And there is a big issue now about how do we look at this entire sector and how do we make some of it perhaps more legitimate and some of it really reduced in terms of what it does, because in reality it's not productive. We lose that amount every year in terms of proper productive capacity, that the economy could be doing so much better if that money was actually spent in a different way.
Well, the white elephant in the room here does seem to be weapons, because this is obviously a controversial industry. It's not illegal, so surely this was counted before.
The real thing is how you count some of the amount that is actually being spent producing them, whether it's included in capital investment or whether it's just seen to be an intermediate production of anything the armed forces do. And I think that is the change that's taken place also in terms of R&D. Are we basically talking about something that just contributes to the final thing out there, or is it a thing in its own right? And I think there's been a change in that definition, which is really why suddenly we have some things that we weren't counting separately before being counted now.
Is there a concern to include weapons? Because, for instance, if a warship or plane was wiped out during a conflict, could that wipe off millions or maybe even billions off a country's GDP?
I think there is a big issue about decommissioning generally. So we're not just talking about weapons, we're talking about what do you do about energy decommissioning, nuclear and so on. What they've done here is suggest that, in fact, at the end of an asset's life, you've also got to count that in as well. So you've got to take account of what it means for GDP. I think that's actually a fairer way of looking at destruction that may happen at times. If you look at what happened after the Second World War, assets were destroyed to such a considerable extent that one had really started to from scratch in order to get back to some normality. And I think definitely not having any real view of what happens to this asset which is finally decommissioned is quite an important part of what we were missing before, and hopefully we'll have something better in the future.
Vicky, thank you.
Thank you.